Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to our thing, reading Carl Schmitt's concept of the political. Today we're looking at section 4 of it and continuing off where we left off. So let's go to it. Let's go right through it. Section 4. Um, um, every religious, moral, economical, ethical, or other antithesis transforms into a political one if it is sufficiently strong to groups of human beings effectively according to the friend and enemy. In other words, if these things, religion, moral, economy, ethical, or other kind of the antitheses that are within it, the things in it, they transform. If people strongly care about it, like they want to, again, remember, they want to kill because of it, then it becomes political. In other words, that once there is the friend, that they see the other as an enemy, that I must exterminate, I must, that we could have the potential that we are that I'm at, they are going to try to harm me, or they're going to, they're so existentially dangerous to me that I have to oppose them. Okay, this is this idea that these things can become strong enough that if it is sufficiently strong enough, that antithesis between the two, it turns itself into a friend's enemy. The political does not reside in the battle itself, which possesses its own technical, psychological, and military laws, but in the mode of behavior which is determined by this possibility, by clearly evaluating the concrete situation and thereby being able to distinguish correctly the real friend and the real enemy. So it's not, in other words, he says that politics is not the technical aspect of conflict. That conflict and the conflict of engaging and how this conflict between the friend and enemy is done, these are going to have, this is, tactical, psychological, military laws and principles and things that do it, right? But rather, the political is understanding, being able to evaluate, what he says here, to being able to evaluate the situation, and being able to distinguish correctly, truly, correctly, not correctly, the real enemy and the real friend. That is, in other words, you have to know who is really your friend and who is the real enemy. Not, the real friend, not just a friend, not, and concretely in this situation. A religious community which wages war against members of other religious communities or engages in war in other wars is already more than a religious community, semicolon. It is a political entity, period. So, in other words, the example here is religious community. If they're waging war on other things, other faiths, or they're waging war, they're not a religious community. They're not. It's not religious. It's political. Okay, it's a political entity. If it is a political entity when it possesses, even if only negatively, the capacity of promoting that decisive step, when it is in the position of forbidding its members to participate in wars, i.e., decisively denying the enemy quality of a certain adversary. In other words, even negatively, it's a political, and even when it possesses only the negative thing, denying that is the enemy, to deny its people, people, that they cannot see that person as the enemy. That's a political act, he's saying, even the negative action here. The same holds true in the association of individuals based on economic interest, as, for example, an industrial concern or a labor union. In other words, that therefore this is idea that economic activity itself can become political if it all of a sudden organizes and sees the other as an enemy in that sense. It radicalizes the relationship and it sees the situation as an us versus them, a zero sum game. In other words, this is politics is in this sense is the world of zero sum, not necessarily zero sum games, but there is, well, maybe this is the point. This is that it becomes such a threat that there is not a situation where the rules of economics, which goes beyond zero sum games, right? And economic is that you know um, you're going to engage in trade, and that's going to be a win-win situation for the buddy. If it is not a win-win, you walk away. You do another exchange. Um, in other words, as also a class in the Marxian sense ceases to be something purely economic and becomes a political factor when it reaches this decisive point. For example, when Marxists approach the class struggle seriously, they treat the class adversary as a real enemy and fights him either in the form of war, in a war of state action. Sorry, in fight him in the form of a war of state against state, or in a civil war within a state. So therefore, this is like the Marxian that engages in class conflict is no longer. This is not longer economics. You've gone from economics to politics. That once you see the enemy, you see them as the enemy that must be destroyed or opposed and fights them. You're no longer engaged in economics. You're engaged in politics. That's why this is the lie of economics. Marxists, oh, this is the laws of economics. No, the laws of economics show that there are there's different classes, and that these classes have different interests. That one must destroy the other, or one must overthrow the other. That's a political, not economic argument. Okay. The real battle is then of necessity, no longer fought according to economic laws, but has, next to the fighting methods in the narrowest technical sense, its political necessities and orientations, correlations and compromises, and so on. In other words, he's saying that the class analysis is no longer the simply analysis of class and the structures of interest and these things, but rather what? Well, it's this not and it's more. It's, in other words, it's about fighting it, but not fighting in the technical how to fight. That's what he says. But rather the political necessities and orientations, the coalitions and compromises, and so on. Should the proletariat succeed in seizing political power within a state, the proletarian state will thus have been created. So if the proletariat seizes control of the political power, then the proletarian state. This state is by no means less of a political power than a national state, a theocratic, mercantile, or soldier state, a civil service state, or some other kind of political entity. So the Marxist idea doesn't make the Marxist, by taking over that, does not just end the political. The Marxist doesn't really, when the proletariat, the workers take over the state, it doesn't end the state. It only turns it into a proletarian state. That is the insight that he's trying to hit here. And this is the difference between a Lenin versus a Marx. This is the difference why that someone like Lenin understood what the diehard Marxists didn't understand this. Lenin understood this. This is why Lenin was successful, and those other Marxist revolutionaries before him weren't, in that sense. They were naive. Were it possible to group all mankind in the proletarian, in bourgeoisie antithesis, as friend and enemy in proletarian and capital states, and if in the process all other friends and enemy groupings were to disappear, the total reality of politics would be revealed insofar as concepts, which at first glance had appeared to be purely economic, turn into political ones. If the political power of a class or of some other group within a state is sufficiently strong to hinder the waging of wars against other states, but incapable of assuming or lacking the will to assume state power, and thereby decide the friend-enemy distinction, and if necessary, make war, then the political entity is destroyed. In other words, the political entity is destroyed. In other words, in other words, if the political power of a class, if the political power of a class or someone other group within a state is sufficiently strong to hinder the waging of war against other states, but incapable of assuming or lacking the will to assume state power in itself. This situation, this is that weird thing about Marxists in that sense. They want to stop the war, but they don't want to take control. Well, this is what happens here, and then if I decide on the friend-enemy distinction, assume and therefore decide on who's the friend and who's in other words, who controls the state, who controls the sovereign, and who's in the state determines the friend and enemy. This is that aspect, right? They are the one who will decide on who's the enemy and who's not. They're not going to do that. Therefore, and if necessary, make war. Right, right. Then the political entity that the part that the part this the proletarian, if they're just wanting to prevent the state from doing something and not taking control of the state, then that's when it's no longer, it ceases to be political in that sense, right? Or it's destroyed, right? The political entity is destroyed. The political can derive its energy from the most varied human endeavors. So therefore, comma, from the religious, the economic, moral, and other antitheses. So therefore, in other words, the political, this contestation between who's the friend and who's the enemy, and this contest of this situation of survival of the body politic against other people, or in the system itself, in this given body politic, the ability to control this, right? This is can get all these this thing can be get energy from the moral, the religious, the moral, the economic, these antitheses, right? It is not just it does not describe its own substance, but only the intensity of the association or disassociation of human beings whose motives can be religious, national, in ethnic or cultural sense, economic or another kind, and can affect at different times different correlations and separations. So therefore, this is the argument here, that the political talks about this friend enemy, this situation, this tension of friend and enemy, and that this conflict of contestation, and that yes, these other factors are energized, give energy towards it. But it says that the political does not describe its own substance, but only the intensity of an association or disassociation of human beings whose motives, in other words, it describes this intensity of things. So what's the it there? I'm confused. Is the it the political, or this tension association? Okay, this is that thing. The real friend and okay, it's the friend enemy grouping, right? The real friend enemy grouping is existentially so strong and decisive that non-political antithesis, at precisely the moment at which it becomes political, pushes aside and subordinates its hitherto purely religious, purely economic, purely cultural criteria and motives to be conditions and conclusions of the political situation at hand. So remember, in other words, that once this friend enemy grouping this is so strong. So if one of these non-political antitheses becomes, whether it's purely religious, purely economic, or cultural, this becomes the situation, right? It pushes aside. In other words, if a religious moral thing like this becomes a political thing, what happens is the political dimension of it pushes aside the religious, the purely religious, he says, the purely economic, the purely cultural, cultural criteria and motives. Okay. Rather, it's just winning and losing, right? Winning, getting power, seizing power, controlling it. This grouping is therefore always the decisive human grouping. the political entity. So therefore, this is this, and in many ways, this is isn't this the ultimate argument here. This is arguing. This echoes the classical argument that the political is the architectonic. This echoes the very conception of the older argument that the political is the ultimate. It's not. It's the ultimate. It is the high. It is the ultimate thing. It is not. They're not equals. In other words, it is the. In other words, the modern liberal idea thinks politics is just one sphere that is equal to other spheres, right? What Schmitt is saying here, Schmitt is agreeing with the ancients in the sense that the political is the highest, and all these other ones are subordinate to it in a sense that or at least rule over it, right? But not in the same way. And he's kind of reversing it. That what happens is that once these tensions become intensified, then they even get puts aside the criterion motives that for inside of that criteria, this one of these uh, antitheses is then put aside for the sake of the reality of the situation, right? Of the This grouping is therefore always the decisive human grouping, the political entity. If such an entity exists at all, it is always the decisive entity. And it is sovereign in the sense that the decision about the critical situation, even if it is the exception, must also always necessarily reside there. In other words, it's the one who decides. That's why it's sovereign. It is sovereign. It makes the decision here on whether the situation is there or not. It not only determines what it defines who's the friend and who's the enemy. It defines whether whether there is an exception that we need the norm is no longer possible. It creates the norm, but it also determines whether the norm is to be followed or there's a crisis. A valid meaning is here attached to the word sovereignty, just as to the word entity. So therefore, this is a value meaning, a valid. Something is valid. A valid meaning is attached here to the words. In other words, the sovereignty has it's something valid here. A valid meaning is attached here. Something valid or real about sovereignty as entity, the body that's created, right? Both do not at all imply that a political entity must necessarily determine every aspect of a person's life, or that a centralized system should destroy every other organization or corporation. Okay? So in other words, it doesn't require that. In other words, this is that line here. This is the Schmitt has constantly maintained this idea and thus never attained a thought of a totalitarian state from Schwab. This kind of disproves that he's a total state thinker. In other words, it's not that everything subordinates to the sovereigns. In other words, not every decision, not everything. It may be that economic considerations can be stronger than anything else desired by a government, which is ostensibly indifferent towards economics. Likewise, religious convictions can easily determine the politics if an allegedly neutral state. What always matters is only the possibility of conflict. So the possibility, in other words, he's not saying that this political entity must regulate and centralize everything, centrally control everything. In other words, this is only that it's the highest and authoritative because it is the one that deals with the conflict of this contestation of conflict that involves war, and it decides whether there is going to be you're going to engage in it, and who's the friend and who's the enemy. And yes, that economic situation can lead to that. In other words, can be stronger than anything desired by government, right? Which is indifferent towards economics. The state can be indifferent towards economics, but the forces that why they do it is why that these forces can be strong and don't necessarily lead to state action in that political sense. And likewise, a religious conviction can easily determine the politics of a neutral state. In other words, what always matters is only the possibility of conflict. If, in fact, the economic, cultural, or religious counterforces are so strong that they are in a position to decide upon the extreme possibility from their viewpoint, then these forces have, in actuality, become the new substance of the political entity. In other words, he's saying if political, cultural, religious counterforces are the thing that's so strong, and they determine and they decide upon the extreme possibility of their viewpoint, these are the new power. This is the new political entity. This thing becomes the new political entity. It would be an indication that these counterforces had not reached the decisive point in the political if they turned out not to be sufficiently powerful to prevent a war contrary to their interest and their principles. In other words, if they can't stop the war, they can't stop the conflict. Should the counterforces be strong enough to hinder a war desired by the state that was contrary to their interests or principles, but not sufficiently capable themselves of deciding about the war, then a united political entity would no longer exist. In other words, if they did it, but they couldn't to direct it, then the problem here is that if they had that enough power to stop them from making a decision, then the state would cease to. In other words, the political entity would cease to not exist. So that's when the state doesn't exist. The political form doesn't exist. The political form must be able to make the decision. And the other parts, if they don't want it, they can block it, but prevent. That's even interesting. He says that the entity is an entity only when the friend and enemy that we can make this decision. If the forces in it wants to prevent, they want something else, but not strong enough to make the decision to make it that something else. But block something, the state from doing it, then the state doesn't exist in that sense, he says. Interesting. The political entity does no longer exist. However, one may look at it in the orientation towards a possible extreme case of an actual battle against the real enemy. The political entity is essential, and it is decisive entity of the friend or enemy grouping. In other words, this idea there's a battle. This is essential, and in this, and not in any kind of absolutist sense, it is sovereign. So in other words, it is ruling, not in an absolute that I'm the king, right? Absolute in terms of I control everything. In other words, it's not that. In other words, that the political is not a totalizing ruling thing. It is rather that it is the thing that determines this Christ. It rules about this question of the friend. In other words, it is the entity that is decisive. The question of the friend and enemy grouping. Who's the enemy? Who's the friend? And determining this. When the political significance of a domestic economic associations had been recognized, in particular the growth of labor unions, the laws of the state appeared quite powerless against their economic weapons, the strike. Consequently, some have somewhat somewhat hastily proclaimed the death and end of the state. As far as I can tell, this emerged as a doctrine of French syndicalists in 1906 and 1907. This, in other words, this is the famous thing. Let me quote this. This enormous thing, this death of is the death of this fantastic, prodigious being, which held such a colossus place in history. The state is dead. E-birth, whose ideas stem from George Soros, Sorel, in the socialist movement, pamphlet 1907. Leon Dejeut cites in his lectures on law, the social law, on the social law, and the law of individual, the individual and transformation of the state, of state law. okay, of individual and transformation of state law. He considered it sufficient to say that the sovereign state conceived the person is dead, as conceived. The sovereign state conceived as a person is dead, or at the point of dying. Right, this is that line of there. Although the critique of sovereignty is always the same. So even though the idea that person is dead, right, or point of death, the sovereign state conceived as a person is dead or point of dying. But though the critique of the sovereignty concept is already the same. Interesting additional examples of the cynical diagnosis of contemporary state appears in Esmeen, the element of constitutional law, of constitutional right is light, law or right, or justice, constitutional justice, right? And above all, the particularly interesting book by Maxime, the transformation of the public puissance. The transformation of public power. That's power, puissance. With respect to the diagnostics of the state, the Synlogist doctrine is also to be distinguished from the Marxist construction. For the Marxists, the state is not dead or at the point of dying. The state is rather a means of bringing about classes and necessary to make the classless and then stateless society. But in the meantime, the state is still real. And precisely with the aid of Marxist doctrine, it has received new energies and life in the Soviet Union. So that's this idea against the syndicalist. Duguet, in this context, is best known a political theorist. Ever since 1901, he has tried to refute the conception of the sovereignty and the conception of the personality of the state with some accurate arguments against an uncritical metaphysics of the state and personification of the state, which are, after all, only remnants of the world of princely absolutism, but in essence miss the actual political meaning of the concepts of sovereignty. In other words, he's saying Dwight is kind of right when he talks about personalization of this, because this was true of the absolute, what we call the princely states that was in the 18th and 17th century. But as we come to depersonalized states and this thing that it misses it. Yes, princely ambition and these things are no longer the case, but it doesn't mean sovereignty doesn't exist, right? He goes, similarly, this holds true for G.D.H. Cole's and Lasky's so-called pluralism, which appears somewhat later in the Anglo-Saxon world. Their plural. Okay, this is great. This is a survey of samples of Cole thesis founded by him is reprinted in Proceedings of Aristotle, 1916. The central thesis here is that the states are equal to other kinds of human associations. Following the work of Laxey mentioned in the problem of studies in the problem of sovereignty, authority of the modern state, foundations of sovereignty, grammar of politics, and in fact, is the article 931. Also see Kung Chao Hai's political pluralism. For a critique of this pluralism, see Eliot, The Pragmatic Politics of Latsky, American Political Science Review, 1924. The Pragmatic Revolt in Politics by Eliot as well, I think. And Schmitt's Stop, Think, and Plural State, State Ethic, Ethic of States, and the Pluralistic State, right? Kant Studies, 1930. On the pluralist splintering of the contemporary German state and the development of parliament into a showcase of pluralist systems, see Carl Schmitt's Hunter Devant, in other words, as defender of this is his thing, the guardian of the Constitution, right? Now he goes as far as the translator can gather, Anglo-Saxon theory of pluralism was unknown in Germany until Schmitt called attention to it. So therefore, that's interesting in that sense. In other words, Lasky in this understanding of it. The historical context to which Lasky always returns, and which obviously made a good impression on him, is the simultaneous and equal and successful attack of Bismarck against the Catholic Church and the socialists. In culture comp again, in the culture comp against the Roman Church, it was seen that even a state of unparalleled strength of Bismarck's right was not absolutely sovereign and powerful. This state was equally unsuccessful in its battle against the socialist working class. Would the state would the state have been successfully strong in the economic domain to remove um, again the economic domain to remove from the labor unions their power to strike? The answer is maybe not. Maybe yes. Maybe no. Maybe they could have done that. This critique is largely justified. This of, of this, the critique of Bismarck. The juristic formulas of the omnipotence of the state are, in fact, only superficially secularization of theological formulas of the omnipotence of God. In other words, this is, in other words, as early 1922, Schmitt asserted that all specific specific concepts of theory of the modern state are secularized concepts. This is his political theology, right? He's repeating his political theology. Also, in the 19th century, German doctrine of the personality of the state is important here because it was part of a polemic antithesis to the personality of the absolute prince, and in part to a state considered as a higher third, vis-a-vis all other social groups, with the aim of evading the dilemma of monarchical and popular sovereignty. So therefore, this idea of this was the state aim of evading the dilemma of the question of monarchy. There was the idea is this. What is he saying about this question here? The problem with the state is with Hobbes that this whole question of it's easy to see in Hobbes that you can don't he talks about a sovereign as being a person, but it's also a constructed person. Whether it's whether is it really a person ruler absoluting, or is it really a something that is constructed and therefore the executive is merely an agent of this. Now this is that weird problem in Hobbes, and this is the whole problem that the language of in Germany was trying to avoid this question because they didn't want to have the argument of popular sovereignty, but they wanted to have the power of the state, which is distincted from the rule of the prince. They didn't want to go to the idea of the republican idea. The Prussians didn't want to have, they wanted a state, but they didn't want to have the popular sovereignty, right? A popular state. And this is what he's trying to do. Therefore, this question here is this third problem, right? This, in other words, the third problem, personality of the absolute prince and part of the state, considering it as a higher third option vis-a-vis all other social groups, right? It is the highest thing. But with the aim of evading the dilemma of the monarch versus the popular sovereignty is the basis of that state, right? But the question remains unanswered. Which social entity am I, if I am permitted to use here the imprecise liberal concept of social, okay, which social entity, he's saying, please let me use the incorrect, the improper, imprecise, here the imprecise liberal concept of social. Which social entity decides the extreme case and determines the decisive friends and enemy groupings? So this question remains unanswered. Neither a church nor a labor union nor an alliance of both could have forbidden or prevented a war with the German Reich might have wanted to wage under Bismarck. So that even though that he doesn't able to control these things, the workers and the church together were not powerful to stop a war that Bismarck wanted, as the German state under Bismarck wanted. He could not declare a war against the Pope but only because the Pope no longer possessed the just belle, in other words, the cause of war. Right? In other words, no longer possessed a just cause, a good cause for this. And also, the socialist labor unions did not want to appear in the role of a belligerent party. So, in other words, he couldn't declare war against the Pope Because why? Because the Pope doesn't control. He's not a state, really. The papal state. Well, it's not really a state. It's in Italy now, right? And this is after the creation of the new Italy in that sense. Um, in any event, no organizational opposition ever imagined could have possibly deprived the German government of making the relevant decision in the extreme case. Such an opposition would have risked being treated as an enemy and thus would have affected by all the consequences of this concept. In other words, furthermore, neither the church nor the labor union was prepared to engage in a civil war. That's even more interesting. This is I'm going to look at 17 about Fergus's modern church, Church of the Modern State. Noted that Maitland, whose legal historical research has likewise influenced the pluralists, considered Goethe's the Deutsche Gesellschaft to be the greatest book. Gesellschaftlich, the law. I think this is the German. Uh, the German nation, the right of the German nations, right, to be the greatest book that he had ever read, and remarked that the medieval controversy between church and empire, between pope and emperor, or more precisely between the spiritual order and temporal order, was not a controversy of two societies, but a civil war within the same social entity. But today, two societies, du populi, face one another. And this, in my opinion, is correct. In the period prior to the schism of the relationship of the Pope and the Emperor, still could be understood according to this formula that the Pope possessed the authoritas and the Emperor the potestas. According a decision existed within the same entity. The Catholic doctrine since the 12th century has maintained the Church and the State are two societies, and indeed are two societases, and that both are societases perfecta. No, this is that they're both complete societies. The complete society. Each one sovereign and autocratic in its own domain. So therefore, this is two states. They're both societies. The societas is not communitases. That's interesting, and that the society is perfectas, in which each one sovereign and autocratic, ruling. Naturally, on the side of the church, the Catholics recognize their church as the only societas perfecta, whereas the side of the state today, a plurality of societies perfecta whose perfection concerning the great number become a very problem. The very extraordinary, clear summary of Catholic doctrine is contained in Paul Simon's Staat and Church and State, Dutch, books 1931. The coordination of church and labor unions, which is typical of the Anglo-Saxon pluralist notion, is naturally unthinkable in Catholic theory, and is just as inconceivable for the Catholic Church to permit itself to be treated on equal levels with an international labor union. In reality, the church serves Lasky, as Eliot aptly remarked, only as a stalking horse for labor unions. A clear and fundamental debate on the two theories and their mutual relation is unfortunately missing on one side, missing so far on the side of the Catholics, as well as on the part of the pluralists. That's 16, which I'm not talking about. That's 16. That's 17. Because Lasky also refers to controversy of the Catholics with Gladstone, the following sentence is cited from John Henry Newman's letter to Duke of Norfolk. Suppose England were to send her ironclads to support Italy against the Pope and her allies. The English Catholics would be very indignant. They would take part with the Pope before the war began. They would use all constitutional means to hinder it. But who believes that when they were... Well, man, sorry about that. We got interrupted. Probably because I have to keep the door open in the summertime because I don't have air conditioning. And because of that, it's not summer, it's May. Okay, it's just... But I need to keep this open so we don't suffocate. And what happens is people sometimes come in. That's fine. Okay. So therefore, that's this whole idea of this question about the trees. He says, what does there say they would submit themselves to they wouldn't go to war with England. They would do everything to prevent Parliament doing it, but then they would not go that further step of waging war with the. Okay, we have to go. Hold on. The 16. That's it. So this discussion of Furrow's book on the modern state, the historical context to which Lackey always returns and obviously made a great impression on him is this culture count, right? This is that what he said here. We talked about that, right? Where am I? Right here. Okay, maybe that's what I have to do. 18. No, we did 18. That's the whole landscape. Okay. So hold on. Back to 18. So furthermore, the church nor labor union was prepared to engage in civil war. And it even talks about the question of Lasky's use of the point of England, right? These considerations are sufficient to establish a reasonable concept of sovereignty and entity, even responding to Lasky's pluralist position. The political entity is, by its very nature, the decisive reality, regardless of the sources from which it derives its last psychic motive. In other words, what the psychological motive. In other words, what was this? What is the thing? What is the thing causing it? Where were the sources of why this conflict of friend and enemy is happening? That doesn't matter. What matters is that if this entity is making a decision about friends and enemy. The political entity is by its very nature the decisive entity, regardless of the sources of it. Right? It exists or does not exist. If it exists, it is the supreme, that is, in the decisive case, the authoritative entity. So it either exists or doesn't exist. It doesn't exist when the system can't make a decision. If the system is unable to make a decision, and that's what a state, in a way, civil that if the state is if there's no way that there can be a decision, but the state cannot decide anything. They prevent it, and there's an action here that must be done. But in other words, but they won't wage war, civil war. They won't take control of the state, or they just prevent it. Then the state is dead. The state is no longer. There is no political entity. There is no political entity. But what if there is the political entity? It's the authoritative one. It's the decisive one. That the state is an entity, and in fact, the decisive entity rests upon its political character. So the state, as long as the state remains the embodiment of the entity of the political, then it is the decisive element. A pluralist theory is either the theory of state which arrives at the unity of state by federation, by a federalism of social associations, or a theory of the dissolution or rebuttal of the state. So pluralism is either, in other words, the mechanisms that explains how the deciding factor of the state comes to being through this a federation of social associations, right? Or a theory of its rebuttal and its a dissolution or rebuttal of it, right? If, in fact, it challenges the entity and places the political association on an equal level with others, for example, religious or economic association, it must, above all, answer the question as to the specific context of the political. What is that? Although in his numerous books, Lasky speaks of state power, state politics, and sovereignty and government, one does not find in these as a specific definition of the political. The state simply transforms itself as an association which competes with other associations. It becomes a society among other societoses, which exists within or without the state. So, in other words, the pluralist model just sees the state as one other social group, one other society. Each one of these things, church, state, society, these are all societies, and they're all kind of competing with each other, right? In other words, this is the pluralist model. It doesn't really define this. And it said that if it's a federalist model, the association explains how decisions are made, then that can be done. Or disassociation. It's plural theory. Pluralism is either shows how this state comes to be through associations, or it dissolves it. But the problem with Latsky is that Latsky treats this but never defines what political is, right? Never, one does not find in these specific definitions of the political. The state simply transforms itself into association, competes with other associations. It becomes a society among other societies, which exists within or outside the state. That is it. That is the pluralism of that is the pluralism of this theory of state. It entirely it's entirely ingenuity is directed against earlier exaggerations of the state, against his majesty and his personality, against its claim to possess the monopoly of the highest unity. While it remains unclear what, according to this pluralist theory, so therefore, this is the problem with the theory. It doesn't really give a new definition of what the state is, right? It says it's against this older theory of the monopoly of the high. In other words, it's against the personalist, against its claim to possess the monopoly of the highest unity, while it remains unclear what, according to this pluralist state, the political entity should be, right? At times, it appears to be its old liberal form, as the mere servant of an essentially economically determined society. At times, particularistically, as a distinct type of society. At times, pluralistically, at a distinct type of society. That is, as one association among other associations. At times, as the product of a federalism of social associations, or an umbrella association of a conglomeration of associations. This is his mocking of these. This is against Schmitt's kind of little mockery of the Latsky-esque pluralist argument. Above all, it has to be explained why human beings should have to form a government association in addition to the religious, cultural, economic, and other associations. And what would its specific political meaning? What would be its specific political meaning? In other words, it doesn't do this. It doesn't explain this. Why is why is a political association necessary? And what is its specific political meaning? Right? No clear chain of thought is discernible here. What appears finally is an all-embracing monistically global and by no means plural concept, namely coal society and Latsky's humanity. So, in other words, this is Cole talks about society, Latsky humanity, and therefore this is what's wrong with Latsky's. And they don't define what the political is. They treat the state, they treat the political as one association. I thought other type of associations, but the problem with this is that it doesn't understand what how is this political thing political, and how does it distinctly differ from the other things. And then, in other words, he complains at saying that, okay, these other things exist. Well, how is this political thing political? And he says there's a lot of them. No clear chain of thought is discernible here. What appears is only this all-embracing, monastically global things like society. And again, that's just the trick. In other words, society and humanity is meaningless. There's something you've just all embracing a global, monistically global, and by no means pluralistic concepts that is society is. The pluralistic theory of state is in itself pluralistic. That is, it has no center but draws its thoughts from different intellectual circles, religions, economic, liberalism, socialism, etc. So in other words, it has no real center, has no idea. This is a real criticism of it. It's either it is a hobgoblin of the ideas from different places. It has no real coherent or inherent thought. It ignores the central concept of every theory of the state, the political. And it does not even mention the possibility that the pluralism of association could lead to a federally constructed political entity. It totally it totally revolves in a liberal individualism. So therefore, this is the thing about this is it doesn't come to an entity. It just totally revolves in a liberal individualist idea. He said atomistic actors like this, right? The result is nothing else than a revocable service for individuals and their free associations. So this pluralism is nothing results nothing else in a revocable service for individuals and their free associations. One association is played off another, and all questions and conflicts are decided by individuals. In reality, there exists no political society or association, but only one political entity, one political community. The ever-present possibility of a friend-enemy grouping suffices to forge a decisive entity which transcends the mere social association groupings. So this is his response. His response: in reality, there exists no political society or political association per se as these lower equal things. Rather, in other words, but only one political entity and one political community. The entity and the political community are the same. The ever-present possibility of friend-enemy groupings suffice to forge that decisive entity which transcends the mere social association groupings. In other words, the possibility of a friend-enemy grouping of these associations creates the political entity, which transcends these groupings. The political entity is something specifically different, and vis-a-vis other associations, something decisive. Now, this is 19, and then he goes, this is later, sociology of great wars. We can, Weltkriegs. We can say that on the day one mobilizes, on the day of mobilization, the hitherto existing society was transformed into a community. This is the idea of this. This would be something. The political entity is something specifically different. This is something decisive. Were this entity to disappear, even if only potentially, then the political itself would disappear. In other words, the political is this. In other words, if this entity that determines the need of the friend and enemy, of what is the friend and enemy deciding this, if this disappears, then Schmitt thinks that then the political would disappear. Only as long as the essence of the political is not comprehended, nor not taken into consideration, is it possible to place a political association pluralistically on the same level with religious, cultural, or economic or other associations to permit it to compete with these. Right? Only, in other words, we can only do that competing with these things if what? If the essence of the political is not comprehended. In other words, if we don't understand, in other words, we don't. Everyone here doesn't comprehend that the political is the thing that is decisive. We don't comprehend what the political is not comprehended or not taken into consideration. Then it is possible to place this like this. We can force it, right? As we shall attempt to show below in section 6, which is the checks and affidavits, the concept of political does yield pluralistic consequences, but not in the sense that within one and the same political entity. Instead of the decisive friend-enemy groupings, a pluralism could take place without destroying the entity or in politics itself. In other words, a pluralism could take place within a system, but not destroys the political entity or the nature of the political itself. So this is attacking the thing, and this is what he'll show in the 6th section. that the concept of political yields pluralistic consequences. So therefore, the political is not a denial of what the pluralists are trying to say, but that these pluralist thinkers they don't understand what politics is. And because of that, they misunderstand the phenomena they're talking about. That's what Schmitt's saying here. In other words, which are consequences. But okay, let's repeat that. It says that we will attempt to show that the concept of political use pluralistic consequences, but not in the sense that one would within one and the same political entity. Instead of the decisive friends-enemy groupings, a pluralism could take place without destroying the enemy in the politics itself. This is where he ends this chapter. Okay, let's stop. It's been long. We can say if you have any questions, please put them below. If you have any questions about what it discussed in this section, about what he's talked about pluralism and things like that. If you liked it, like it. Hit the like button, share it with friends, share it on social media, encourage other things to do it. If you've subscribed, if you haven't subscribed, or subscribe to help build the channel, get other people to subscribe so we can build the channel some more. If you and share this with a friend that we're doing these kind of things. If you didn't like it, I'm going to say no, thumb down and say what's wrong here. Say what's wrong in the comments so that we can learn from you, right? If you want to follow me on my social media links are below. If you want to help me do what I'm doing here, financially or by other means, you can do two ways. There's two links below to Patreon and things. Of course, this is I understand this. I'm late to this, and people don't really come to. I'm way behind the curve, and I think I don't even have any people in it when I made the video. I had one person once, but I think he quit it. Okay, he didn't renew. Or he made one payment once, a $5 payment. But you can do it through Patreon or Subscribestar, or you can go buy one of my books that listed below. Well, that's it. We'll see each other next time. Again, I do these posts are Tuesday, Thursday postings. On Monday, Wednesday, we post on the Montesquieu, and Friday always is our live stream. Okay, take care, and again, Friday, noontime Eastern Standard Time, U.S., or 6 p.m. Central European Time. Okie dokie, take care, bye bye, have a good day. So long.